Hello, welcome to Recovery Demystified, a show where we explore our relationship to substances from a radical, non-religious, and empowering lens. Our sobriety is not a purity contract. It is an invitation to become curious about ourselves and find our own unique paths to growth and healing. If you've been questioning the role of alcohol or drugs in your life and haven't found the resources that you need, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello. Welcome back to Recovery Demystified. My name's Early. I'm so happy to have y'all here today. Today, I'm really excited to share my conversation with Elizabeth Roberts about her book, In Praise of Addiction. Y'all, I consume so much recovery content, and I am absolutely obsessed with reading recovery books. And you know, I'm pretty critical about them. If you've ever listened to my recovery resources episodes, I have a pretty serious filter for what I think is good in that field. And when I got an email from Elizabeth about her new book, I was just immediately intrigued because it was called In Praise of Addiction, which, you know, that's not a phrase that you commonly hear. And so I just immediately had to learn more. And I asked if they would send me a free copy. And when I got the copy in the mail, I read one chapter every day with my breakfast. And it was so good that I literally looked forward to eating breakfast every day. Some of the things that I thought were super revolutionary that I absolutely loved about it was this destigmatizing viewpoint on substance use. Let's not hate ourselves or each other for having an addiction. I don't know, like, why is that not a more common thing to think? Like, addiction is so deeply stigmatized, and then when we internalize that view of ourselves and start to live with that deep shame, that is like one of the things that drives the addiction and makes it worse and worse and worse. And if we could relieve ourselves personally and culturally of the shame and the stigma that comes along with addiction, I think that things would be way less bad for so many people. So exploring that topic with Elizabeth and reading about that in her book was just mind shifting. Like, it is possible to live in a society that doesn't stigmatize substance use. And as always, if you get anything out of this podcast, it would be super helpful for me in the spirit of reciprocity if you would be willing to hit that subscribe button or rate and review us so we can reach a larger audience. And if you think of someone who might like this episode and needs to hear this message today, go ahead and send them this episode. And also, there is a Patreon that I'm trying to get enough people on there to cover the costs of this podcast. So there is a link to join the Patreon down in the show notes. And I do have a couple more spots open right now for one-on-one coaching. So if you are ready to exit the maze and you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, hit that 20-minute free consultation link down in the show notes. And I'm super stoked to meet you and get out of this mess together. But yeah, there's a ton of super interesting topics that we get into. We talk about inhalants. We talk about compulsive eating. We talk about NAFTA and the drug war. We just get into so many subjects that are really important and a lot of dusty corners. So yeah, I'm really excited to share this conversation with y'all, and I'm super grateful to Elizabeth for her time. And without further ado, here is my interview with Elizabeth Roberts. Hello, Elizabeth. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Feel free to call me Liz or Elizabeth or whatever you like.
All right. How you doing, Liz? Would you start by introducing yourself to the audience? Let them know your pronouns and just a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Roberts or Liz Roberts. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm an anthropologist at the University of Michigan and wrote this book in praise of addiction. And I'm an addict myself.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit before we hit record about how this is the first book from an author that I've actually received in the mail. And it was a wonderful coincidence for me that I found it to be very engaging and interesting and innovative. And I was actually really excited to have this interview. So I'm curious if you would just give the listeners sort of just a brief overview about what In Praise of Addiction is about.
So In Praise of Addiction is kind of goes over, there's three narrative threads in it. And one, probably the basic one is that I'm an anthropologist and I was living in working class neighborhoods in Mexico City where my neighbors taught me a really different way of living, doing, and understanding addiction. And I'll maybe talk about that in a second. And what they taught me ended up really getting me thinking about my own family struggles with addiction, with alcohol, prescription medications, food, love, a whole bunch of stuff. And I use what my neighbors taught me about addiction and start applying it to my own life. And I think that there's a lot to learn from my neighbors. And it's really kind of helped me have a very different relationship to addiction than I did before I started doing this work in Mexico or learning from my neighbors about it. And then I would say the third strand of the book is, you could call it sort of historical or cultural criticism, where and it's woven throughout the book, where I'm taking the reader through the history of addiction medicine and addiction research and being pretty critical of what addiction researchers have to say about addiction.
Yeah, I love your introduction that you gave there. And as my listeners know, I love the gray area of the like nuance of what actually is an addiction and all of the different things that maybe are more like habitual compulsions and the honestly like the devaluing of things like rigid categories, because rigid categories prevent us from accessing help and from engaging with each other authentically when we're sitting there trying to decide, like, am I an alcoholic? Like, I find that stuff to be completely not useful at all. So it was really interesting to read in your book about different cultural perspectives about the use of substances and even going outside of the normal lens of what we consider to be substances in the first place. Like, you talk a lot in the book about the folks that you were living and studying with in Mexico and about their habitual communal use of soda, which for them was called refrescos. And it's just like, I was very interested because I was like, okay, this is going down a lot of different alleys, but it was also like really beautifully woven together. And as I recall, one of your first big realizations in Mexico was with one of the older relatives coming up to your house begging for a drink of alcohol and you sort of being taken aback and not understanding what to do at that time. And that kind of illustrates this new perspective of addiction as something that is viewed completely differently with those folks in Mexico. So would you talk a little bit about that story?
Yeah. So it's actually the story that pretty much begins the book. And it's about moving in with this family, and people live in these kind of collective family compounds that called terrenos. So I move into this terreno, and my landlady's name was, I call her in the book, I call her Dolores. And I have my own little house, and there's a few little houses in this compound. And one morning, her husband, Clemente, starts knocking on my window. And I was so confused because I'm in my pajamas and it's like 6:30 or 7 in the morning. It's like, who's knocking on my window? And it's him. And he's begging me for a tequila or a beer. He's begging me for booze, basically. And I'm kind of in a panic and don't know what to do. And I run across the courtyard to his son's house, and his granddaughter, who's 5, opens the door. And I tell her to tell her mother, like, there's this emergency, what's going on. And I hear her mother, who's still asleep, telling her, just get some tequila. And so I watched this 5-year-old pour her grandfather a tequila. She'd obviously done it before, and then sit with him while he drinks the tequila down. And then later that day, Dolores comes to see me, and she tells me that Clemente has a vice. And I don't really hear what she's saying. I don't really hear the words, but I just say to her, like, well, what do I do if he does it again? And she says, well, just give him a drink. And I'm stunned. And it's this opening part of the book because my sister at that point had been an alcoholic for years. We spent years trying to get her to get sober, to stop drinking. I isolated her. Other members of the family isolated her. I refused to be at social gatherings with her. And it was just all about how you have to stop drinking or you cannot associate with me because, it's so horrible to be around you because you're so filled with rage. And so to have someone who is the loved one, the partner of someone who's clearly an alcoholic, just saying, give him a drink was pretty shocking. And the book then goes on to explore why that is the common response in these neighborhoods in Mexico City and learning from my neighbors about really you never isolate anyone for any kind of relationship they're having to a substance. And really, when people are addicted, for them, addiction is you having a compulsive devotion to a substance that actually connects you to people. And it's praiseworthy. So that's the name In Praise of Addiction. But what Clemente had was a vice. He drank, but he drank alone. And for Dolores and the whole family, the problem wasn't that he drank. The problem was that he would isolate himself. And that was what was confusing. And that's what they call a vice. And for them, addictions were things to be cultivated and vices were things that were puzzling. And you would try to get people to come back to the fold of addiction. And you would never isolate anyone for any kind of compulsion they had with a substance or a behavior.
Yeah, I found that to be like a really interesting and engaging, like it was a brand new way for me to look at things because of course I'm used to like the culture of the United States and that like cultural overvaluing of independence that we have here and the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps crap that keeps us all separated from each other and then therefore easier to control. So hearing this like perspective that there's sort of two different ways to look at substance use. And one is like, it's okay if it's bringing us together. And that's how they view addiction. And then the vice is like, okay, but if you're over there by yourself, isolating, then, you know, that's when we're in the danger zone. So yeah, that was a completely brand new way for me to sort of think about addiction. So yeah, thank you for that. And also it is really interesting and like the story arc of the book of watching you like start out with this like deep frustration with your sister and her addiction and the bad behavior and then like growing to a point with understanding the process of addiction where in the end it's like you're her ally and you're like her biggest, you know, person that's standing up for her. I just thought that that was like really beautiful as well. Would you talk a little bit about how your perspective changed on addiction through learning all of this and how that affected your family?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, first of all, what you said about this thing about independence, that's such a theme throughout the book about realizing that part of the reason, or a lot of the reason my neighbors in Mexico City were acting so differently is that they didn't have this baseline assumption that people should be independent and that they should be in control of themselves at all time. So if you don't have that assumption, how you expect people to act is really different. And, you know, and the more time I spent with them, the more I could see, oh, part of it's what the problem with addiction seems to be in the US is we assume people should have control over themselves and not have dependencies. And so we're really baffled, confused, angry, and scared when they do, or when we do, like, because this is how we're not supposed to be. So that was one of the big lessons. And then the way that really played out in my family, especially around my sister, was, you know, I watched her get sober from alcohol and I experienced it. And, you know, when she was drinking, she was full of rage a lot of the time. And so it was really hard to be around. But over time, after learning from my neighbors in Mexico, I started to feel more and more that at least some of the rage she had was coming from the way that we isolated her from drinking, not really the alcohol itself, but the fact that we were so mad at her for not being in control of herself and for having, you know, bigger emotions than she was supposed to have. And so it felt like we were just in this endless cycle probably of, you know, she drank, then we were mad at her so that she got more angry. And it was just like this vicious cycle that wasn't really about the alcohol so much as our anger at her for not being able to separate herself from the alcohol. And she gets sober about a year or two after I came back from living in Mexico. And by then, or maybe a little before, and I watched her get sober and I was blown away. It was a mighty effort on her part, huge and not really due to any thanks to us, you know. And she's sober from alcohol, but then still so many people in her life start shaming her for the fact that she's dependent on prescription medications. And in her case, benzodiazepines, Klonopin. And she had panic disorder since she was a teenager. And Klonopin had been something that always helped her manage her panic disorder and her large scale emotions in general. And here she was, she had done this heroic thing, stopped drinking, and had to learn to manage her emotions differently. But then the thing that helped her do that, she was still being shamed for using. Like it was like, and then I had already been in Mexico, and it was like, there's something going on here where this is really not just about alcohol. This is about our anxiety and fears about people being dependent on things. And I then become someone who I really hope is her ally in dealing with the fact that she's constantly having to manage increased shame, but also withholding of these medications that help her. A whole bunch of really horrible things happen. She's hospitalized in some pretty painful ways. And it just seems like, wow, this isn't really about these medications as much as our hatred of dependency. And so much of the book is just trying to have fellow, probably middle class Americans who are worried about independence examine more our own fears of dependency. And if we did think harder, or maybe think isn't the right word, feel our way through our fears of dependency, how could that change the way we relate to other people and ourselves around our compulsions, around our addictions? And that, for her and I, radically changed our relationship. And it's also, I think, if she was here, I think she would say this. The work we did together around this helped really change her own feelings of like towards Klonopin. And she's no longer ashamed of it. She's willing to call it an addiction. I'm addicted to it, and be really unrepentant about that. That's an addiction that keeps me with other people. I can stay in people's lives, and I can be with others through Klonopin. So it's an addiction worthy of celebration. It's not a vice.
Yeah, I found that story arc was really interesting. And a lot of it too is it's about that hatred of dependence, but it's also about like people wanting to have this like ultimate control that's in the value of like purity politics, where it's like, okay, if you can't just completely manage every single element of your life without having any sort of like assistance or something to lean on, like that makes you not good enough. And it's another one of those like individualist, like bootstrapping values that's forced upon all of us culturally. And it was, yeah, really interesting watching you and your sister work through that in the story arc of the book. And then, okay, so the third like main theme in the book, as I saw it, was you also interconnecting your own experience with compulsions into your understanding of your family experience and your experience with those folks in Mexico. So I'm curious if you would also talk a little bit about how you connected your own experience with everything else.
So, I mean, what you're saying again about independence and dependency, I developed this figure in the book that I call my inner Yankee. And, I'm using the way that we talk about Yankiness in the United States as this kind of thrifty, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of guy, mostly a guy who is independent and doesn't need others. Um, and I talk about kind of historical figures that have embodied that idea, like, Thoreau, for instance, who wrote Walden Pond. And I realized that even though I'm from this kind of loud Irish Catholic family that's big drinkers and, we're all about excess in a certain way, I also have all of these Yankee-like attributes. Like I'm really controlling about time, and I'm really judgy about Anne Marie while she's an alcoholic. And I would have been probably pretty judgy about her use of Klonopin if I hadn't, been intervened upon by my neighbors in Mexico City who taught me that there could be a different way. And I think what you're getting at is then I start realizing I can use what I'm learning in my relationship to food, because I would say that food has been one of my most out of control areas in my life. Like that I'm the most compulsive and just have always felt really ashamed of my relationship to food. In the book, I start kind of coming up with, I guess, little tools or things that I feel like my neighbors have taught me. And, I learned this tool of replacement. Like if you're going to get rid of one addiction, you have to replace it with another because from their point of view, we should all be addicted all the time. We should have as many dependencies as possible and live in pleasure with other people. And I also just start thinking pretty hard about why I'm so sure that my relationship to food is pathological. And, I spent years not even wanting to eat around other people because I knew I would overeat. But when I was alone, I'd overeat and just trying to do all the restriction that people do around food in the United States, like, and especially around sugar, which is, I would say, my biggest compulsion. Like I would do things like I can only eat sugar once a month, or I totally have to go off sugar or I can only eat it once a week. And what that ends up doing is the moment I would eat the sugar, I would like eat, 12 gallons of ice cream or something like that. And I ended up developing this thing that I called sugar every day. And I got it directly from being in relation to my neighbors, where instead of shunning the things they're addicted to, they start worshiping them. Like they built altars to the things they're addicted to. Like there's this one woman who's addicted to plastic ponies, and she has an altar to her plastic ponies, and that's a big part of the book. So in some ways, I make kind of an altar in my mind to sugar. And I was raised Catholic, and so making altars makes sense to me in all these kinds of ways. And I also had this sense from when I was a little kid and would have to go to church, and I was in Catholic school, like priests have to celebrate communion every day. They have to take in the host. So I was like, well, what if I had to take in sugar every day? Like it wasn't a restriction thing anymore. It was a thing that it's like a commandment that you must have because sugar is a sacrament. It's holy. And when I started doing that, my relationship to sugar pretty radically changed. It's not like suddenly I didn't want sugar. I mean, I guess there's some, you could think of like exposure therapy or something where you like have too much of the thing and now you no longer want it. It's not like that at all. I just now look forward to sugar every single day and kind of plan it out like, ooh, I get to have sugar today at 4 and I'm going to go get this treat or something like that. And it doesn't mean that I can't have sugar at other times. It just means that I must have sugar at least once. And I make it this whole kind of event. And I often still gobble it down because for me, part of the pleasures of eating is not being mindful about it, but just like eating it as fast as I can. And I also honor that, like that's the thing that I'm getting out of this whole situation with sugar. And as I started doing it, it came to feel more and more like some of the stuff you read about in harm reduction literatures, where, there's experiments. I mean, they're not so experimental anymore, where it's like you're in Switzerland and you're a heroin addict and here's your heroin every day. And there isn't scarcity around it, and you're going to have it every day. And it means that you now can live your life. You're not spending your life looking for heroin or hiding the fact that you are using heroin, and you're going on and you get to have this thing that gives you could give you a lot of different things. It could give you intense pleasure. It could give you a kind of a moment of soothingness in the day. It could give you a momentary form of obliteration, so you don't have to feel all the feelings. It could do all of these things. People have different relationships to different substances. And I know that it can be somewhat potentially challenging to hear sugar and heroin put in the same kind of equated in a way. But I think there's some useful things to do when we do that, or that happen when we do that. And so sugar every day became something that I learned, or that I developed in relation to learning about a new way of doing addiction that has really changed me in all kinds of ways. And I feel like I really revere sugar in all that it does for me, instead of trying to get it out of my life like I used to. And that's been powerful and also peaceful.
It's amazing to hear you talk about the relationship to sugar when you're pushing it away and using those purity politics, and just how that digs that well of shame so much deeper inside of us. And then when we're able to like cast that away and be like, no, I'm worshiping this shit, then all of a sudden it's like our relationship to the thing is like a bit more level-headed and healthier and less extreme because it's not tied to that deep well of shame. And it doesn't mean that like, oh, this is magically the best decision for my health now, or now I can all of a sudden control myself or something. But like to remove the guilt and the shame, I think is a massive step in the right direction, because one of the things that keeps people with addiction stuck is that cultural conditioning that we are bad, that stigma, that not being able to control yourself makes you bad. And then if you think you're bad, you're not going to make good decisions for your life. You're going to make self-destructive decisions. So I think any step away, and I do also see what you're talking about is harm reduction, and any step away from hating ourselves for wanting to like seek comfort in some way, I think it's great. And what you were talking about brought up before we hit record. I was saying, I don't talk to authors on this podcast. This is not the podcast where you're going to hear me talk to Gabor Mate or whatever. Yeah. So I've grown a lot in this particular arena, and I love Gabor Mate's work, but when I read his books, I'm like, I don't give a shit about your fucking CD addiction, you rich prick or whatever. And so the person inside of me who is like your sister Anne Marie and who is like that old man Clemente who needed a drink at 6:30 in the morning, I'm the like panic attack, ruin your life drunk or whatever. I mean, I've been sober for a long time, but that was me. That's the person I identify with most. And then when I hear like, oh, I'm a college educated freaking professional studying you addicts or whatever. Normally, I would be like, fuck you. I'd be like, fuck your sugar, like get a real addiction and come at me later when you've smoked some crack, like give me a call. But luckily for me and my growing and burgeoning interest in the gray areas and just like trauma and the human psyche in general and cultural conditioning and how everything is absolutely tied together in this web, I can be grateful and interested in the fact that you are able to interweave your experience with people that have substance addictions and then have it enter your life and be able to like broaden out and soothe your internal shame with your experience. I just think at this point in my experience with like being obsessed with addiction and recovery, I'm just really grateful that there's people out there at all that are willing to look internally at their own things that they struggle with and see how those gray area things are related to other people that may have what is viewed as like a more serious or like more dangerous substance use issue. So I want to say that I'm grateful that you went into this in your book and that also it was really vulnerable of you to share that with the world. So thank you.
Wow. Oh my God. You just said about 50 things I want to respond to. Can I try a few?
Try a few.
Okay. Thank you for saying that. And I think you outlined really well some of my own kind of hesitations about talking about sugar in relation to like, people getting like my sister spent a night in jail and crash cars. And this is, they seem like these are different things, or Gabor Mate and his CD collection, which I actually also talk about in the book, because I just think there's the fact that it felt okay for you that I equated those things. I'm moved by. Thank you. And I think we can go a little farther maybe in why it can be so frustrating when people like Gabor Mate talk about his CD collection. And I'm going to give it a stab, and I'd love to know what you think. What I think Gabor Mate is super smart and very interesting and very soulful. But I also think, even though he's a Buddhist, he's a Puritan. And he wants to tell us that as humans, we are deficient in our need for release and oblivion. And so he's compassionate about people doing heroin that he's working with because he's compassionate towards himself, or he realizes, I have just as little control over my CD addiction as they do over heroin. So he equates himself with the folks that he's working with to treat, but he's still working with this deficiency model that both he and the heroin users are not adults, because they have these hungry ghosts in them. They have these voids that they're trying to fill. And I think what was so powerful, what my neighbors taught me that felt so powerful, is there's nothing immature or non-adult to want to have these excessive experiences, especially if they're with other people. And so he's always like, you shouldn't want to fill your void. And I'll just use my sugar thing as an example. There's so much stuff out there that tries to say, oh, we're going to be compassionate about your alcohol use or your, sugar addiction. You just need to get mindful about it. And there's so much mindfulness stuff. And I really, if mindfulness works for you all out there or you early, that is great. But what I learned from me is that my relationship to sugar and eating in general is about seeking, not always, but sometimes forms of obliteration. And that is what I want. So it's not like I started eating sugar and have this incredibly mindful relationship to it where I eat it really slowly or savor it molecule by molecule. It's like, no, every day I need this release of sugar where I'm obliterated. And that is, I think, also what people often, not always, want with substances that we would talk about as harder, heroin or, and I just feel like what my neighbors are showing is that that is okay. That is something we can embrace. Like obliteration, a compulsive devotional obliteration is something that might be the okay thing to do. And Gabor Mate is saying we should never be mindless. And that anytime anyone is overeating, they're immediately, or taking too much heroin or buying too many CDs, they're immediately suspect as someone who's not in control of themselves in this incredibly Buddhist mindful way, which kind of throws me at the wall.
Yeah, I actually personally find Buddhist concepts to be really helpful in my healing, but I also it really resonates with me what you're saying, that like anti-puritanical concept and like sometimes just let yourself be obliterated or whatever. Like I highlighted the word ravishment in my notes here. I really appreciated the I guess the illustrative nature of that word and how it appeared in your book and how it's like a permission giving device that no, we don't have to be perfect healed humans. Like we can be doing our best. And if we have horrible, really serious problems, obviously, if you want to look into that and work on healing, absolutely make your life better. But this made up fake goal of, yeah, we're all going to be perfectly mindful and we're never going to want to escape reality and we're never going to want to self-soothe or something because we're just going to become so perfectly tolerant with all of the world's ever more growing fucked up circumstances. Yep. It's an impossible standard. So yeah, I did really appreciate that permission giving to be no, we're humans and we experience such intense emotions with the world around us and the things that we enjoy and the ravishment that one can experience with just really diving deeply into something. I thought that perspective was really, really interesting to hear. And as we're talking about Gabor Mate and things like that, so whenever I start reading a book that's by someone who's college educated and not just one of us schmucks living in the dumpster and huffing whippets or whatever, I tread very lightly, basically, because specifically with reading people like Gabor Mate, you kind of get this vibe that he's the smart doctor man and you addicts are just like you people. And you get compassion, obviously, and I think that he does great work. But when I open these books, there's a pink flag immediately when someone has letters after their name, and then also when it's a white person studying people of color, I'm I step very lightly into those anthropological landscapes because it can be very icky very quickly. But my pink flags really went down in your book when I was hearing about NAFTA and the drug war effects on Mexico and Carl Hart's research on race and oppression and drug use and things of that nature. So I'm curious how you make sure to create an environment of anti-racism as a white anthropologist studying people of color.
Yeah. Wow. It's a big, huge question. And, it's one of these things where I don't think I totally had this worked out. But I can tell you, some of the ways I've tried to navigate those issues, imperfect as they are. Anthropology is has a totally messed up history, as you might or might not know. It's a totally colonial discipline. It was kind of got going in terms of literally, like, I mean, one way that it got going was British colonial authorities in various places around the world writing reports about the natives. And those British colonial authorities became anthropologists, and their reports were used for ill in all kinds of ways. So it doesn't have, it has a very, very messed up history. And I also think, though, that there aren't very many approaches in the academy where it's actually the point is to try to understand difference and, in a way, make the world safe for difference and make the world understand that there are more than one way of living in the world. And one of the ways that that's been kind of meshed, that's messed up history and kind of this interest in being able to document human diversity or difference, is that more and more anthropologists are from the communities in which they are studying. So someone from Sri Lanka is an anthropologist of something in Sri Lanka or a community in Sri Lanka. Someone who's from a white working class world is an anthropologist of that world in some way. And then there's those of us like me. I'm a white anthropologist. I'm a middle class from California, doing work in working class neighborhoods in Mexico City. And, I don't know how much longer there'll be too many white anthropologists doing that kind of work. And I'm not saying, oh, that's sad that might not happen any longer. But I do think that one of the things that one can do in anthropology is try to write in ways that aren't about, oh, look at these people over there doing weird things that are different from us, but instead writing about how difference shows those folks who are, I'm going to say, implicitly in power, like middle class white people in the United States, that the way they're doing something might not actually make that much sense or might not actually be the most beneficial to the world. So a lot of what I'm trying to do in the book is use, and I am owning that word. Like, I am using what my neighbors taught me. So we could call it an extractive relationship. I'm using what they taught me to shine a lens on what we could call dominant culture in the United States, to try to push us to do differently, because there's so much damage that comes from this judgmental stance around addiction in the world. Like, basically, the drug war is fought in our name. Our fears of addiction are the thing that fuels this relentlessly violent, devastating set of processes around the world. I mean, it's just a few months ago, the Trump administration was bombing boats off the coast of Venezuela in the name of the drug war, in the name of fighting drugs, which, as probably most of you listeners know, is complete bullshit. The drug war is not there to fight drugs in any way, shape, or form. It's to do a whole bunch of other things, but it is done in the name of fighting addiction. And if I can get any reader to kind of start questioning their own sense of why they think addiction is so inherently pathological, and thus question the drug war a little bit more, that would be that would be a win. But back to writing about, working class people in Mexico. It was a long process of trying to write it and giving it to lots of people and saying, like, I wasn't really getting it right in all kinds of ways. Partly because it's hard to write about people. So my neighbors in Mexico City are all about celebrating excess and kind of thumbing their noses at respectability and middle class values of, like, saving and not being excessive, and writing about it in a way that I can convey to the readers why this is important without making the readers judge who they're reading about is tricky. And I had to get a lot of help from all kinds of editors and friends and colleagues to do that. And the other thing is I was doing the research. I wasn't going to study addiction. I was there. I collaborate with environmental health researchers and public health. And I actually think they need anthropologists. They need ethnographers so that they don't keep replicating white middle class ideals about what good health is in the world. And I'm the anthropologist that showed up to do that. But what my work now is training anthropologists in Mexico to continue that work, because I do feel like that is who should be doing the research, not necessarily me. But the inequities of the world make it so that if you are from the United States and a university in the United States, you're much more likely to have grant funding to do that kind of research. And a lot of my work has been about like, okay, I've had that grant funding. Now, how can we set up systems or like a sustainable way of doing ethnographic work in Mexico by Mexican anthropologists? And I'll shut up. But the last thing I'll say is that that's tricky too, because just being a Mexican anthropologist doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be able to bridge issues of class. Like if you're someone that can go to school and become an anthropologist or an ethnographer in Mexico, it probably means you aren't from the neighborhoods that I'm writing about. And there can in some ways be more tension between someone from a working class neighborhood in Mexico City and from a middle or upper class neighborhood in Mexico City than between me as a kind of gringa outsider and someone in a working class neighborhood. So all of these relationships are really complicated. They're really impure. They're very imperfect. And yet I don't really know how getting rid of ethnography, paying attention to other people's lives would actually help the world be a better place, when knowing about how people do things differently, like my neighbors doing addiction differently, I actually think is a very powerful and important thing to do in the world. And I happen to be the person to do that and it's not a coincidence. You know, I'm the person that had the resources to go and be able to have the funds to do the research. And it's because I'm a privileged academic from the United States.
Yeah, privilege has so much to do with it. And it's obviously like a highly nuanced and complicated topic, because also like you said, and like you talk about in the book a lot, the folks that you were living with in the poorer neighborhoods seem to be like highly stigmatized for their lifestyle by other folks from more wealthier neighborhoods in Mexico City.
Yeah.
So yeah, just sort of endlessly complicated. I had a question about, as you were talking about the drug war, I remember reading about the drug war and NAFTA and how that led to a sort of lack of corporate responsibility, and how the government subsidized sugar and water and for the soda companies, and how then there's like a lack of clean drinking water because the government was subsidizing the soda companies, and then the people were drinking delicious soda and then all bonding together in their addictive ravishment together. And then the same government who, through these policies of supporting the soda companies and not allowing clean drinking water to normal people who are then drinking the soda that they're supporting, then all of a sudden the government is putting up billboards like, oh, don't drink the soda, you guys, it's bad for you. And it takes the responsibility off of corporations and off of the government and puts it onto normal people. And this isn't like the only time that this happens. It happens just absolutely all the time. It happens with alcohol, with Drink Responsibly. It happens with, I think it was like ExxonMobil or something like that invented the carbon footprint and tried to make individual people responsible for the pollution of Earth that's caused by mega corporations. So this whole issue is like, it's just rooted in global capitalism and it's everywhere. But the advertising is effective. That guilt mechanism is effective. And I'm just curious if you would talk a little bit about the soda addiction and then how, NAFTA and everything is all tied up into that.
I would love to. I mean, first of all, it's what you're getting. I mean, you articulated the argument so beautifully from my book. So I just feel like you should teach it. Thank you. And the thing that you're saying about the individualizing these health campaigns, like don't drink soda, drink responsibly, pay attention to your carbon footprint. It goes back to the exact same thing that drives our shame about addiction, which is you're supposed to be an independent individual who's responsible for yourself. So the thing that, it's like what NAFTA and the drug war is doing and our own shame about our addictions are all of a piece of this idea that we are individuals that are in charge. And that diffuses all responsibility from corporations, as you so nicely put it. So, what I track in the book is the way that, actually, let me say one other thing. You know how we were just talking about equating sugar and, harder drugs, right? I think and a lot of the book is about how people are addicted to sugar, or soda, actually. And one of the things that I like to point out when I talk about this to people is that we can say, like, oh, heroin's deadly, alcohol's deadly, but actually, probably numbers wise, globally, sugar kills more people than any illicit drugs or alcohol. Like, and especially in a place like Mexico, the rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease that are directly linked to things like drinking soda instead of water it's like the rates are just staggering. And so soda is killing way more people than alcohol or drugs. So the stakes of an addiction to soda are high. It's not acute in the same way, like, oh, there's an OD from an opioid, something like that, or a car crash from drinking alcohol, but the stakes are very, very high. And everyone that was drinking soda and reveling in their soda consumption was, themselves diabetic, or knew someone that was diabetic, had relatives who had had limbs removed because of being diabetic. And they had such a different attitude about their relationship to soda, though. In some ways, they were saying they had a defiance. I talk about defiance in the book. Like, this thing where we have access to soda, it's almost cheaper than water. And in some ways, it is cheaper than water, and it's more reliable, and it's more delicious, and it brings people together more than water. Like, you can tell us to stop drinking it all you want because it's not good for our individual health, but that's not our definition of health. Our definition of health is collective joy and pleasure and compulsive devotion to things that hold us together, like soda. And this issue of health, that's on you. That is not on us. They know well that Coca-Cola is being subsidized and being given access to the aquifer, which allows soda to be priced so cheaply, and other sodas to be priced so cheaply in Mexico. And it's their attitude towards this, like, no, this isn't on me as an individual to make sure I don't drink soda, is really similar to the way that people would be in these neighborhoods really defiant against the drug war. Like, it was sort of like, the drug war kills people. Drugs don't kill people. And the addictions that come from drugs often bring people together. So one thing, and this kind of gets back to this conversation about anthropology and everything. I mean, I think what was so powerful to me is that my neighbors weren't people who had gone to, like, fancy PhD programs and learned about structural inequity. They just knew from living that there's all these inequalities that are produced, and that there's all these messages being sent towards them about that they must control their individual health. And they were 100% not buying it. Just like you. I mean, in your critique of capitalism, they just, and to be able to document that when these folks are people that are constantly reviled for being excessive or being uneducated or being stupid because they're not listening to the public health campaigns, feels like what we would call in academia a powerful intervention. Like, to say, like, no, people are really pretty clear. They know what's going on. They've heard the education, and they're saying, we have a really different way of being healthy in the world. And that's about collective effervescence, collective joy and pleasure together. I could do more on NAFTA and the drug war, but I think you did a great job yourself describing the issue.
Thank you. Yeah, it rings so true with me because I think about alcohol companies. Alcohol was probably the most serious of my addictions. And I think about how alcohol companies spend like $5 billion a year in the United States advertising. And they tell you, like, oh, you have to have this to have fun. You have to have this to relieve your stress. You have to have this to, enjoy a vacation or a wedding or dinner, that you have to have this. You have to have this or you're not normal. And then when you drink it, something chemically happens in your brain where the part of your brain that's responsible for impulse control is physically offline. Like, that thing is no longer there. And then they tell you to drink responsibly after that. And it's like, I don't think that this is going to work out for many people. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it is one of these things where we put on the individuals the stuff that we could think about managing structurally, or if we're not going to do that, not criminalizing what happens afterwards. Like, so we can think about safe use zones or safe use, basically places where you can go and shoot up heroin and people can watch you and make sure that you're not going to overdose. And we did try in Prohibition to outlaw alcohol. That didn't work out and led to more criminalization. But I think a more collective response to, we know what substances can do, and they're powerful, and we can manage them in all these ways without shaming people for becoming out of control or compulsive, could be a way forward. But we could never let corporations be the one in charge of that. I mean, all they do is want to get as much of the stuff in people as possible.
Absolutely. And then deflect all responsibility.
Yep. Yep.
So one of the last things I wanted to touch on was, you talked about in your book people that had inhalant addictions. And this is something I harp on a lot because personally I had an inhalant addiction. I used a lot of whippets and then a lot of poppers after a while. And I feel like there's these like varying levels of stigma with all addictions, but it's like, okay, if you're addicted to alcohol, you're normal. If you're addicted to heroin, you're a bad person.
Yep.
And people who have inhalant addictions are just society is so disgusted by that even everyone else that has an addiction to something else pretends that inhalant users don't exist, because that is too weird. So whenever I hear anyone else talking about inhalant addiction, I'm like, oh my God, someone else is actually paying this some mind and noticing that it's fucking real and it's happening. So I'm curious if you would just talk a little bit about your experience with folks using inhalants.
Yeah, yeah. But as always, you just said such an interesting thing before that I need to address that, or I need to speak to that. I mean, this thing about the way we kind of put hierarchies on addiction or anything feels like it's kind of one of the things I'm really trying to address in the book by giving us a model for thinking about addiction more generally. Like and my neighbors were like, an addiction is anything that you are compulsively devoted to that holds you with other people. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be alcohol. It can be inhalants. It can be plastic ponies. It's anything you don't have control over, where you're hanging out with other people. And vices, again, are anything you don't have control over that takes you away from people. And that's the only way they distinguish. They don't distinguish between, alcohol's worse than pony collections. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at, where I'm saying, let's think about sugar and heroin in the same frame. What is our fear about not being in control? But now let's talk about inhalants. So the neighborhoods that I lived and worked in, they're not poor per se. I mean, one of the things that's so important in these neighborhoods, I don't talk about much in the book because that would make it too academic in a way, is that almost everybody had absolute housing stability. So these are pretty cohesive neighborhoods where people had been living for decades. Their families were there. Kind of everyone knows each other. And there's a fair amount of public drug use, especially in this one neighborhood I talk about a lot that I call Colonia Periférico in the book. And a fair amount of people are drinking on the streets, a fair amount of people, and I should say mostly men, and we can have a long discussion about the gender of drugs and alcohol, and a fair amount of people are smoking pot in public. There wasn't very much obvious opioid use. And then lots of people are huffing. And the thing that most people are huffing is this thing that they call Activo. And it's not glue, it's paint thinner. And it causes hallucinations, and it's really cheap, and it's not a controlled substance. I mean, these neighborhoods are filled with little hardware stores. They're called talaparias. And because there's so much home industry, like people doing woodworking or metalworking and things like that. So all kinds of industrial solvents and paint thinners are everywhere. And so it's a really cheap, easily available drug. And lots of people, mostly men, but not only, were doing Activo a fair amount of the time. And, or I mean, we're doing it publicly. And people weren't like hiding their children from this, because not being in control of yourself is not a terrifying thing for people in these neighborhoods. Like, if a kid sees someone not being in control, it's not like, oh, that is shameful. So I got to know a fair amount about inhalant use and came to learn that, again, the distinction wasn't like, oh, use is worse or better than alcohol or marijuana or soda. It was whether or not someone is doing the inhalants with people or alone. So if a young group of men is on a pilgrimage to St. Jude, say, that's a pretty common pilgrimage, and they're all huffing, they're all sniffing the Activo, the paint thinner, and they're hallucinating, and they're, doing it pretty regularly. What people do is they take it out of the can and put it in a little, like a plastic or glass container, and then they have cotton balls at the top, and the cotton ball is saturated with the paint thinner, and then you smell it, and then you have the experience. It doesn't last very long, and it also makes you not very hungry. So if a group of young men is doing that together, they're engaged in an addiction, and they're addicted to the Activo and to each other and to St. Jude. They're devoted to all three things. And then, but if you see a young man on the corner by himself doing Activo, and I talk a lot in the book about this young man, Osvaldo, who's often on corners by himself doing Activo, that he's lost to vice. So again, it's not about the Activo, it's about, is he alone or is he with other people? And just because he was alone meant that, or I should say it a different way, his aloneness wasn't a cause for shame. It was something that made it so that people wanted to bring him back into the fold, or they were constantly giving him odd jobs or giving him food, trying to get him to eat. Because everyone assumes that at some point in life, everyone's going to have a vice. Everyone's going to find something that takes them away from other people. And that's the thing that needs to be worked on, not the fact that it's Activo or alcohol or soda or heroin, although heroin wasn't very common in these worlds. But they're just, and I guess the last thing I'll say is, it's just really common. It's kind of everywhere. And I think it's partly just because it's really cheap and it's really available.
I think that overarching theme of the book of people not being stigmatized for the thing that they're addicted to, even when it got to the point where their community was worried about them and when it was considered a vice. Like with Clemente, it was still like, get him a drink if he needs one. And with Osvaldo, it was like, give him a job, buy him some food, even if he doesn't want to eat it. Like it wasn't like, oh, there, that crazy guy is on the corner, like just turn away. It was like, this is our community, this is our family, and like, we're still going to help each other, even if people are not doing well. And that really like struck me deep down for sure, because there's so much stigmatization and people getting pushed out of society in the United States for having their addictions. And seeing that documentation of that, of folks being like, just genuinely caring about each other in every state. That was really moving for me.
Oh, thank you. And that's, I mean, again, you just basically distilled the essence of the book. And what I am trying to say in the book in so many ways is like, it's not that these substances are harmless or don't have effects, but that I think if we got somehow, and I'm not even sure we could, but somehow got rid of that judgment and stigma, so much of what we think is the effect of the drug would actually be gone.
Yeah, a lot of times, I mean, with basically everyone that I've ever talked to that's had a pretty rough addiction, it's the shame. It's the shame that keeps us stuck in it. And as soon as we can like lift that, and the shame comes from inside of us, but first it comes from outside. It comes from outside perception, and then we internalize it, and then we spiral down, down, down. And if we can start by removing that shame culturally and then within ourselves, it's going to lead to more folks finding healthier relationships to substances and also finding healing if they need it.
I agree. I completely agree.
Was there anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to talk about?
Oh, God, that's a good question. I just feel like you are a comprehensive interviewer. I mean, there's a lot in the book about, eating and love. And also, I guess one of the other little tools I come up with in the end is like building altars. And I already mentioned that, but I think that is one of the places I get to in the book. And I would hope that if anyone read it, they would maybe find that interesting or actually more useful. Like what's useful in the book. But this has just been seriously one of my very favorite conversations I've had about my book. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, I thought it was great. At first, I was like, she's doing too much. And then I was like, she's doing just enough. Well, if there's nothing else you wanted to get to, I usually end with the same two questions. And one is, what do you think people don't understand about addiction?
Wow. I think that they don't understand that it is actually a completely regular part of the human experience, and we don't need to pathologize it.
Hear, hear. And then the last thing I usually ask is, if you could speak to someone in the darkest days of their addiction, what would you say to them?
Is there any way I could help you not feel as ashamed?
Yeah. Yeah, we talk about how a lot of times we feel so alone in our addictions. And as soon as you reach your hand out for help, you'll notice that someone is there to grab it. So it sounds like you would be there to grab it.
I think, and that I'll credit to my neighbors and to my sister who stuck with me, given how horrible I was with her.
There's a redeeming story arc in the end, though. So
Yeah.
yes.
I hope so. I hope so.
Awesome. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Early. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Recovery Demystified. If you like what you heard, share it with a friend or rate and review us so we can reach a larger audience. Recovery Demystified is produced and edited by me, Early Brunner. Stevie Petet made our logo. Our beautiful theme music is by Logan Bragg, and our social media manager is Kaylee Bausch. We are entirely supported by your generous donations as a 501c3 nonprofit. You can find a link to donate in the description. May you be happy and free, dear listener.